you know, we can take them up as we go along. Please tell me when you get the email.
Yes, sir. Still.
Okay, so let's get started now. So, at your convenience, Shivangi, just put up the first slide, please, and we can then
Yes, sir.
proceed.
Perfect.
Okay, so but in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, let me start off by saying, when we talk about uh, governance, I think it's important to get a historical perspective. Why is there even a need to talk about governance, good governance? Why are we even talking about things like environment, society, and governance, and what's the link? So I think we need to go a little back in time, and what we need to understand is that whenever people are doing things and creating value through either using natural resources or through their own efforts or whatever, and once they're selling these goods to others, the recipient of the goods needs to know that whatever is being offered is exactly as promised, and it is whatever money I'm paying for those goods are legitimately going to be used for giving me what I have asked for. And throughout ancient history, if you look at history, we'll see that throughout times immemorial, especially after humans started to trade and uh, there was a great deal of emphasis on ensuring that people could rely on the mechanisms that would assure them that what they have asked for is genuinely going to be delivered to them. Now, this could be small communities in the same nation or the same geography, or it could be, uh, you know, nation states trading across the oceans. But at the heart of it, as the title slide shows, good good governance or good management of the business was essential to ensure that the process would carry on with trust, integrity, and longevity. Because performance is obviously linked to longevity. If your company one transaction wonder, it's not obviously something that creates value in the long term. So that's point number one. Now, so throughout history, we have seen that many people would ensure that there was a system created to establish this trust that businesses that would trade would assure. So, for instance, the guilds and bodies corporate that were committed to trading, they would always have the approval of the king or queen or the monarch of their region or the chief of the tribe or whatever. Because nobody in his or her right mind would want to trade across boundaries without some kind of confidence being communicated to the other side that this has the wholehearted support of the reigning monarch or the chief of that region. So, I don't know if many of you are aware, but when the East India Company was founded in December 1699, it was Queen Elizabeth I who authorized this company to do trade across the oceans. So this was also prevalent in other parts of the world, and you could see therefore that companies, and not companies in those days, but small bodies that were indulging in trading, would use the name or the seal of the monarch or the region to ensure that this would get done. At the same time, you would also have payments being made through a bunch of trusted intermediaries who are known as hawaladars, or in different parts of the world they were known differently, or there would be actual physical transmission of gold and silver coins. And the fact of the matter is that all this was done to ensure that there was trust in the business, and a trustworthiness was created, and to ensure that whatever is happening is going to enable a continuation of the relationship or the partnership. Now, this is what used to happen in the olden days, and as many of you know, there's a bunch of these seals that you can find in museums today. It's going back from almost 2,500 BC all the way to the present days. This is the East India Company seal. This is the Dutch East Indies Company seal. This is a seal of the United States Security and Exchange Commission, and this is the SEBI seal of 1992. All these, when used appropriately, they give confidence that the parties involved are pursuing things in the right fashion. So, this is at the heart of governance, ensuring that all the concerned parties, now in the olden days, predominantly the buyer and the seller, but increasingly nowadays, it isn't only the buyer and the seller, but it also includes many, many other stakeholders who need to be ensured that their value or their access to value is not jeopardized by virtue of what the company is doing. And this is a very, very important requirement when we go further into discussing the ESG aspects. Okay, so if any questions, please feel free to write them in the box on the right hand side. Now, let's look at corporate governance in the present day. Now, one of the definitions, and let me tell you, there are multiple definitions of corporate governance. So I've tried to really put them into a very, very succinct fashion because at the end of the day, we need to understand what is the primary motivation to emphasize corporate governance. So, corporate governance is the collective impact of and the state of a company or an enterprise based on an interplay of the company's values, principles, systems, processes, decisions, and metrics. That means it's a sum total of how a company is able to deliver its output, but it is also an indication of the state of the organization based on how it addresses a lot of the interfaces it has with the outside world, which obviously derive from its values, principles, systems, processes, decisions, and the measures that they take to monitor what's happening. Obviously, as you can very well understand, corporate governance is meant to enhance the value and reputation of an enterprise by doing what? By enabling everybody who is a part of the organization to contribute to its value addition process. Now, this is a reason why corporate governance isn't only confined to the boards, as many people wrongly think. Corporate governance or guidance from the board might certainly be forthcoming, but what is important is how do the agents in the organization, the employees, the managers, and everybody else, how do they ensure that they're also adding and contributing to the creation of trust and reputation and value in the enterprise? So it's a very, very important aspect which needs to be kept in mind. Corporate governance also helps to assure all stakeholders and certainly shareholders that their financial and other interests and investments are safeguarded, and the outputs of the enterprise will be produced as promised. And in doing so, and this is a very, very important point from the perspective of ESG, they are doing so without adversely affecting the well being of other stakeholders. You see, there has always been a predominance of emphasis on shareholders because they're the ones whose money used to go in the company, they're the ones whose money still goes in the company, and a predominant emphasis only on the shareholders, ladies and gentlemen, it has created huge anguish over the past 2, 3, 400 years. For instance, slavery was a result of corporate greed, but where the whole emphasis was on only generating profits for the owners without any consideration for what it might do to the lives of the millions of people who were actually forcibly imported from the African continent into North America. Similarly, the acquisition of lands in many parts of the world, including in South America, in Africa, and other places, has happened because the whole emphasis was only on one group of stakeholders, namely the owners. So we have to appreciate that good governance is something that in this day and age has to cover not only the shareholders, although those do remain an important part of the equation, but in this day and age, when we talk about good corporate governance, we are talking about the kind of governance that ensures that every single stakeholder's interests are safeguarded. And when we talk about safeguarding it, what we're really saying is that the ability of the other stakeholders to have access to value creating opportunities should not be diminished. And we'll explain this in greater detail once we go a little forward. But for now, let's look at some of the other points about good governance. And it's obviously, as I have said from the very beginning, it is linked to ethical principles. You cannot be running an ethically sound organization on the principles of good governance if fundamentally there is a flaw in the intentions of the enterprise. So at all levels of the organization, from the boards, the managers, and to every other decision maker in the company, it the decision making, the soundness of the output, and so on, all this has to be interlinked with the principles and values of the enterprise, which have to be communicated, internalized, upheld, and recognized across the enterprise. So it's a very, very important point to remember that good governance is not something which comes out of the air. It's linked with what is our intention, what's the dharma of the organization, how do we make sure that we abide by it and serve the greater good of all stakeholders. Now, coming specifically to some of the things that good governance ensures is when we talk about uh, the ultimate purpose of good governance, it is to add value, which I mentioned, and it should enable others to also ensure that they can contribute to the generation and participate in the creation of value. We talked about this. But specifically with respect to a clutch of stakeholders, as we said, shareholders have to be protected and equitably rewarded for their investments. Workers have to be rewarded for their intellectual contribution and for the physical and other work that they do in the organization. Customers have to be given quality products and services at better and better prices, which means they have to deliver value, they have to be given value competitively. There has to be adequate remuneration for suppliers and timely payment of their uh, for the services and goods that they get from for the main principal company. Creditors have to be told that yes, they have lent to the company and their financial contribution will be restored and they'll be compensated for the amount of money that they have given. And nowadays, unlike in the past, and I want to emphasize this, unlike in the past, it is also the responsibility towards society, the environment, and to the principles of good ethical relations with all stakeholders that underpin good governance today. That means in the olden days you could get away with slavery, you could get away with murder like the British East India Company did in India. You could get away with what uh, the many companies did in Mozambique and Belgium companies and so on. Very, very tragic. Those of you who are interested can read some of that in history books or in books of economic history. It is very, very sad. And therefore, if there are people in the world who are afraid of companies generally, it's because they have seen how companies have been so exploitative of other stakeholders that it's left a kind of a deep-seated scar and a trauma inside of them. Okay, there's a point that is being brought up by Mangesh Dakure. He says the East India Company and British colonizations demonstrate the worst form of exploitation. Correct. Why do we still start a CG lesson with their example as origin? No, I am not starting their example as an origin. I'm saying that what they did are examples of no corporate governance, where there is absolutely no means to rein them in their mad pursuit of profits. So I'm not saying that what they did was right. I'm only saying what they did was so wrong that today, in this day and age, any company cannot perform if that is the approach they're going to adopt. So that's why we are saying that today corporate governance has to ensure that it has to care for every stakeholder, not merely the shareholders. Okay, now I'm talking about transnational corporations because these have been among the greatest violators of good corporate governance even today. They're the kind of companies that are still around the world, and as you can see, after World War II, these companies have become more and more massive, more and more powerful. And in 2021, the 449 companies listed in the Standard and Poor owned about 45% of the world's productive assets, estimated at about US dollar 10 trillion. Now, this is huge, the control that they have. Now, why am I mentioning this? When a company becomes so powerful, for instance, you're aware that Microsoft, Microsoft's own uh, profit after tax or profit before tax, I think, is close to 57 or 58 billion US dollars. That is greater than the GDP of many, many small nations in the world. So when you have a company with such tremendous clout, it definitely gives them a sense of hubris, and they think they can get away with anything. And TNCs dominate many industries: automotive, oil, gas, minerals, food grains, information technology. These are really monster sized companies. And we are now talking about ensuring that they function in a way that the well being of all stakeholders is taken care of. The reason I'm highlighting this is because, given the fact that they're so powerful, they do sometimes give short shrift to good governance and pursue what they think is good for themselves. And we'll define in some more detail what we mean by being good for themselves. And many of the transnational corporations operate beyond the laws of just one nation, because they operate in, say, Africa, in India, in Southeast Asia, in the US, in England, and the European Union, and so on and so forth. So they have a huge amount of presence around the world, and therefore they're perpetually on the lookout of ways to enhance their ease of operation. That means minimal regulation, minimal compliance to what they think is a restrictive practice. So, uh, obviously, the TNCs focus on profit for shareholders, and they often do so at the cost of others, which means these are the kind of companies that actually are following the example of the British East India Company, or the uh, you know many of the others that exploited the African continent and so on. And that's why they have to be flagged, because these are the kind of companies that have to be reined in through regulators in a manner that good corporate governance is visible at all times from such companies. So that this should be kept in mind, that even in this day and age, despite all the talk about corporate governance, good corporate governance, and focusing only on the well-being of all stakeholders and not just shareholders, we do find many of these large transnational corporations pushing back on regulation. Now, one of the things that also gave rise to the need for
Thank you.
good governance was, okay, there was some background noise. I hope that's controlled now. Yeah. So, one of the reasons why there is always a concern about good governance, many of the owners of a business, those who put in, let's say, a lot of money into an enterprise, one of their concerns is that how do we make sure that the managers who run the enterprise do not shortchange.
There's a network issue, I think. I think there's a network issue at Sir's end, so he'll be joining shortly.
Okay, are we back, Shivagi?
Yes, sir, you're audible now. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a little 30-second gap I noticed.
Yes. So probably you can switch off the video. That will help the signals. Yeah.
Okay, should I switch off video?
Yes, sir. I think that will help the signals. Probably in the area there's signal issues.
Okay, never mind. Okay, but am I audible?
Yes, sir. Very, very much clear.
Okay, yeah. So as I said, the concern of the owners has always been how do we make sure that the owners of the enterprise are not shortchanged by the smart managers who run the enterprise. And these are known as agency issues because the principals are the shareholders and the agents are the managers. So this struggle is a long one, an old one. And in the British East India Company, the directors were all sitting in London. There was always a concern of those managers that look, there we have no idea what's happening in India. Communication wasn't like it is nowadays, and as a result of that, there were so many people who were always wondering that what is actually happening out there in India. And there were many, many occasions where the company directors actually came down quite heavily on some of the managers of the East India Company. Now, this problem is not confined just to those the shareholders and managers. In today's day and age, many companies are also getting a lot of concern from society because a lot of the actions of companies are affecting the environment. They're affecting the ability of other people to have access to the right kind of fair wages and so on. So there is considerable dynamism in this, but it the original starting point for this was being able to see how best we could control the managers from exercising their clout in a way that it would be adverse for the shareholders or the owners. Now, one of the things that you have to see is that how did the shareholders try to protect themselves from this conflict? They made sure that the board would oversee what the agents were doing. There was also a general body meeting of owners who would then ratify what the board was deciding for some of the agents. Compensation contracts, compensation amounts were decided by the board of directors, and the delegation of financial powers to the agents was also limited so that the agents would not become more powerful and do what was appropriate from their own perspective. However, having said that, I want to just take a moment to tell you that despite this, we have many, many situations where companies around the world are allowed to buy back their shares when the share prices are high. Now, this is a clear indication that the managers of the enterprise are trying to maximize their own wealth because many of the companies these days give stock options. And the surest way to increase the earning per share of a stock is to buy back the stock when it is high priced, because when you reduce the number of shares out in the open market, you are automatically increasing the earnings per share. Now, this is something that the managers do for themselves. Unfortunately, boards have been playing along with this, and you sometimes wonder what the heck is going on. Why are boards even allowing this? But companies are so varied and so different, you might see some of these odd situations emerging across many kinds of organizations. Are there any questions at this stage? If you have, please write them down in the chat box on the right hand side and we can take them up as they come. So, I want to now just give a few theories that have been uh, put forth over the centuries to actually ensure that the emphasis of corporate governance was to to make sure that the kind of things that we've discussed were taken care of. So sometimes in the uh, late 18th century, Adam Smith talked about the fact that uh, managers, because they cannot take care of money as the owners do, they'll spend on themselves, they'll do what's good for themselves. So there was a need for some kind of corporate governance, which Adam Smith proposed. Now, it isn't as if they actually came up with something concrete at that time. No, I'm saying that these issues were flagged in the years specified and remain relevant and germane to this day. So again, shareholder versus or stockholder theory. uh, Milton Friedman talked about the fact that the social responsibility of companies is only to minimize their costs and maximize profits. In other words, he would have said that, oh, ESG is all nonsense. And I must tell you a little story here. I was speaking to students and professors at the Kellogg School of Management in Chicago, where Milton Friedman was a professor. And because Milton Friedman had won the Nobel Prize and he was a very influential professor, when I went to speak about the importance of ESG in the governance of companies, and the year when was speaking to them was this was 2006. When I was speaking to them about this in 2006, the professors, they ridiculed what I was telling them, but the students who were younger, they applauded me. And I immediately realized, I said, here is the same school where Professor Milton Friedman had held sway since the 1960s, and even 40 years later, his ideas were still embedded in the minds of the professors. But the students who were younger and who were reading and who were more thinking and thinking about what's happening with climate change and so on, they were the ones who understood what I was telling them. So very fascinating dynamic in that classroom. And I'm sharing this with you because I want you to know that depending upon the kind of notions people have about enterprise, they will pick up what they think is they'll cherry pick and say, oh, this part of good governance I will pick up, but the rest of it I'll throw away. And you have to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that that is not how good organizations are to be run. You cannot cherry pick. You have to make sure that the right kind of framework is created across the organization. Then moving on, in 1978, the resource dependency theory was put forth by Pfeffer and Solanik to professors again, and they talked about the interdependence of the context and so on, which is, I quite honestly, this is just a theory, didn't gain much ground. And there is another Freeman's theory called the stakeholder theory, that this is, to my mind, this is a 1984 idea, which I think has really caught on, because this is where ESG comes from. Because Freeman talks about that the organization's governance must be developed to take into account the interests of most interest groups without contradicting the ethical principles on which capitalism is based. Now, that's another way of saying that, look, you have to pursue profits, but it must be done keeping in mind the best interests of other stakeholder groups as well. Building on this idea, Donaldson talked about the stewardship theory or the management theory, and he said that owners and managers have no conflict, and it should be the structure should be such that it enables the most coordination between the two sides. And Oki in 2001 talked about the theory of corporate governance, where he said that the disciplinary and cognitive aspects should act simultaneously. I'm just giving you these ideas for the simple reason that, at the end of the day, there are some fundamentals which you have to keep in mind. One is that in the process of creating value, you cannot jeopardize the value creating abilities of any other stakeholder group, including planet Earth as a stakeholder group. People don't look at planet Earth as a stakeholder, but planet Earth is very much a stakeholder, and that is one of the key ideas of the ESG approach to governance. Now, what is it that is prompting people to think about ESG much more? There are three intersecting factors which are pushing more and more companies around the world to look at the Freeman model, where we talk about stakeholders. And these are three factors, namely technological advances, the availability of knowledge on one's fingertips through smartphones, empowered and vocal citizens pursuing personal freedoms and societal goals, and the third and the growing uh, awareness of people of the interdependence of all of life and the fragility and the capacity of planet Earth as our home. These three factors, ladies and gentlemen, are pushing companies to understand that, look, this is something that companies cannot now take for granted that we are going to be quiet, or planet Earth might be, you might throw plastic by the tons into the rivers and nothing is going to, there'll be no pushback, or you can keep on exploiting the hydrocarbon resources of planet Earth and keep on burning that and nothing will happen. So people are now pushing back, and these three factors are also affecting company managements to look more favorably towards the ESG approach of governance, where you take into account environment, society, and the full value creation that impacts all stakeholders in the inside and outside of the organization. So, and this also obviously has given rise to a greater understanding of the spiritual dimensions of life, human rights of humans, rights of animals, climate change, degradation of environment, other development models, etc., etc. So all these factors are making people think about the fact that it is essential to pursue an ESG approach where you take into account all these factors. Now, right in the beginning, we did talk about the fact that you cannot possibly be an ethical organization if you do not have, excuse me, if you don't have a culture of value, or if you don't have principles and values that underpin what is actually being done in the organization. So there is a need for organizations that are committed to ESG to start creating a culture of values that are aligned with the common good of all stakeholders. You can't only have it for shareholders. That we have seen is not workable or viable. It is important to make sure that alongside with the shareholders, the value creating and the value uh, using opportunities to other stakeholders must not be compromised. Then you have to also articulate the values and the linkages and make sure that the clear actions of decision makers are reinforced by these values. There should be openness, transparency, and regular discourse. Opaqueness is bad for good governance. Seeking feedback from key stakeholders on ethical performance, improvement cycles to make sure that the outcomes of what they're doing are not adversely affecting people. Say, for instance, you have these large companies, say even Tata Steel, make sure that on a regular basis they interact with the villages around them to make sure that they're not adversely affected by either the water pollution or the air quality and so on, and then taking preventive action to to make sure that they are not adversely affected. Whistleblowers and whistleblower protection, which even the Companies Act of 2013 talks about, is a very, very important part of the values that support ESG kind of governance. And that's a very, very important requirement, because when an organization is very powerful, there is always a fear of retribution or vengeance by the company against somebody who is trying to flag something which is inappropriate, unethical, or illegal. And therefore, whistleblower protection is a very, very important part of the process. In fact, the Companies Act of 2013 in India even talks about a vigil mechanism, which is an important requirement to make sure that you're perpetually keeping a track on how businesses are managing, how managers are taking decisions, how is the board given feedback and information on what's happening, so that the company does not overall lose out on things like whistleblowers and so on. So this is a very, very important part of the whole thing. Okay, so this is what is essential, therefore, to make sure that the organization is not going to be pursuing ESG in a very superficial fashion, but it is going to make sure that it is the DNA of the organization is changed, so that the governance takes into account not only the shareholders but stakeholders as well. And a sunset clause and frequent review of rules and laws, not laws really, but rules in the organization are important, because this also helps to keep you current with what the trends are. And as far as regulators are concerned, they have to also make sure that you have to you have to change the rules and the laws based on what is appropriate for these current times. Okay, I have a question or a comment from Swastika Mukherjee, and she's talking about, can you shed some light on the grievance redressal mechanism and the best way to developing it comprehensively across stakeholder groups? This is a very, very good point, Swastika, and let me take it up right now. You know, there is no doubt that in spite of a company's best intentions and very transparent governance, there are going to be moments where some stakeholder groups feel aggrieved. The vendors might feel that the company is taking too long to make payments to them. Shareholders might feel that the dividends being given to them are inadequate. The workmen might feel that their salaries are not keeping pace with inflation. There might be many other customers might feel that the quality of the goods being sold to them is not good. So look, some of the stakeholder groups, Swastika, obviously have greater, I wouldn't say clout, but in the hierarchy of things, some stakeholders obviously have a higher weightage, if I may use that term. For instance, if the customers abandon the organization, you might have the best governance, but the customers are unhappy with the goods and services that they're receiving from you, then you might have a great grievance redressal mechanism for all the others. But if the customers walk away, your source of revenue is going to diminish. So there has to be a very, very sensible balance and a very clear emphasis on which are the grievances that need immediate attention, and which are the grievances that can be handled maybe in a slightly, I wouldn't say should not be handled at all, but should be handled after the critical grievances have been addressed. So supposing I find that I'm large company, a mining company, and suddenly there's a bunch of villagers who come and sit right on the place where I'm supposed to do the open cast mining, saying we will not allow you to mine. Obviously, this is a matter which can't wait at all, because if I can't mine, I cannot earn surpluses, I cannot run the company, I can't give returns to my shareholders, I can't employ people, and so on. So this becomes a very critical grievance. So Point I'm trying to make, Swastika, is that all grievances have to be handled based on a kind of priority. So once you've decided on what the critical grievance is, the first and foremost step is stakeholder engagement. Find out what is it that is the problem. And for that, you have either the appropriate stakeholder. So, for instance, if there's a bunch of villagers who are sitting on top of the place where the mining has to commence, the best way to do it is that let the the personnel people, the HR people, or the community affairs people all get together, find out what's bothering the villagers, address their grievances. If there's a need for something that they want, or if we have lapsed in the past and not treated them right, we have to make amends, say sorry, and move on. So there are multiple ways, Swastika, to deal with grievances. I would not like you to to think there's only one way to do it. It's a very, very creative thing that has to be done, but it has to definitely come from a space of love and concern for the stakeholder that is aggrieved. You can't pretend कि ये भाई शोर कर रहा है इसको पिटाई करो इसका. I'm sorry, that is not what we mean by good governance. Good governance is really it might be a slow process, but it is an essential process to make sure that the genuine requirements of people are not only addressed, but they are incorporated into the process of good governance. Does that help, Swastika? Okay, so good. Let's move on next to the third part of my little session, and which is about conditions favoring compliance and good governance. Now, I want you to know that some internal conditions in the organizations favor compliance and good governance, and some external regulatory aspects also nudge and push companies to be compliant on ESG, and generally in good governance terms, they are nudged into being that way. But you have to also appreciate that there is a push from the outside, from regulators, which is important, and there's also a internal leadership drive that encourages companies to comply and be good role models as far as corporate governance is concerned. So, one is, of course, that uh, companies that are truly, truly committed to good governance and caring for all stakeholders, whether environment, society, planet Earth, and all the other stakeholders, they are very, very good about the enforcement of internal rules in the organization. And if somebody does not comply with them, there is a certainty of consequences that everybody knows they will have to face. So, this is a very, very important requirement for an organization. So, for instance, there's a timely enforcement of rules, laws, and anybody who violates repeatedly, a manager or somebody, is is weeded out. There is also no cronism, no privileges to elites, no exceptions, and this refers to the outside regulatory concerns. It's not that because I know the head of the regulating body, I get exemptions. No. So everybody follows the same rules. That is what a regulator has to ensure. The third thing is everybody in the organization is aware of the vigil mechanism, whistleblower protection, and so on. And there is an encouragement of openness, and there is a encouragement of company employees being asked to speak up, writing to the boards if required. The board might have a subcommittee for what's known as ethical subcommittee or an audit subcommittee, and they are the ones who to whom employees can write if there is a if they feel that something is not being done appropriately by the managers or the agents of the enterprise. There's also a need for the financial powers to be delegated sensibly. You cannot have unlimited discretionary powers, because if you have discretionary powers, as human beings, we are prone to uh, biases, and we do tend to sometimes get carried away by that. We tend to get biased in favor of one stakeholder group over another, and that is not necessarily a good situation. And the effective management of polarities. And what are these polarities? Polarities are that in life you will always encounter situations where you will have to choose two outcomes, both of which are not good for all the stakeholders. And you have to be trained as a leader to be able to take such a decision, because now, for instance, there are umpteen examples one can give where both the outcomes are uh, either difficult outcomes because they're both unethical, or they're both ethical, and yet you can't choose without having some downside. Now, that kind of training is also required in the managers, because you cannot be uh, effectively delivering good governance for all stakeholders if you're not able to manage those little trade-offs that are bound to occur when you're treating one stakeholder's needs against the needs of another. Okay, now what are the kind of incentives and training needed by decision makers? It should not be a difficult or uphill task inside the organization for people to comply with rules. Now, this is important, and know in India, many people complain that being ethical is so much more difficult for managers than to cut corners and, you know, just kind of go with the, as they say, just manage the situation. So we have to make sure that managers also have the ability to ensure that they are able to comply with rules despite the so-called uphill task sometimes. Also, we have to create integrity centered incentive systems that clarify the expectations of ethical performance by managers, and where the punishments for transgressions are also very clear. Consistent reasoning and training in uh, evaluation of real life cases, emphasis on logical thinking. Compliance is important when you think critically about matters. Also, there has to be the ease of understanding rules, the elimination by due process of old, inconsistent, or archaic rules in the organization, which sometimes become an impediment to being ethical and governing ethically, and therefore displaying good governance at all times. And helping people to align ethical intention with the skill required to deal with ethical dilemmas and temptations. Okay, now finally we wrap up with just one final slide. Transgression or compliance, individual choices, which means however much a company might have a situation where it wants to uphold good ESG, there can there is still a lot of agency with each one of us as leaders, as operators in the organization, for the uh, for delivering what is appropriate. Now, here is something that I like to emphasize. As humans, you have agency. Your individual choices matter. It is not as if, uh, sorry, yeah, it doesn't really matter that you might have a designation that is far removed from the board. It does not matter. We are aware that individual choices in favor of ethical decisions and actions have really made a huge difference. Individuals who choose to be upright and ethical, because as lawmakers, uh, you know, people can choose to be ethical and upright as lawmakers. They will, you cannot ensure that everything can be regulated. Basically, every citizen has to self-regulate at some stage, and developing internal ethical systems in yourself are an important 21st century skill. Ethical thinking has to be typically, uh, you know, perfected, and we have to make sure that as individuals we choose the hard right over the easy wrong. Because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, however much you might create companies, acts, and regulators like SEBI overseeing everything, fraud happens because people at the individual level are making the wrong choices. So this is, of course, I'll skip this slide. You know, it only reinforces what I just mentioned to you, that your inner resources can give you guidance on how to be ethical, and you need to perfect those. And finally, we come to the end of this presentation, because even though it's a complex subject, I've given you an overview, and I'm hopeful that as we answer questions, you'll be able to better get a sense of what's going on. Okay, I have a question. A gentleman, Mr. Gaurav Sharma, is raising his hand. Yes, Gaurav, what's your question?
So first of all, thank you so much for taking us through this entire course and about the governance. What I exactly want to know from you, as you rightly said, that everything cannot be regulated. For everything, there will not be law. There has to be a choice made
Yeah,
whether what is right and what is wrong. But then ultimately, there are certain gray areas where law is silent, and obviously, when organization is talking about the existence and survivability. Uh, there would be few individuals in the room who would be pushing or gunning for the profitability rather than or taking advantages of the gray areas. How we deal with such situation, how we ensure, because organization as such is doing nothing wrong, even if we go that side. So what is the right thing to do at that point of time?
okay, so Gaurav, this what you said is a very, very valid point. There will always be ethical situations that will pit the governance of any organization against such situations, because the laws can never take into account what is ethically appropriate at all. Ethics, as you know, is also a thing which changes over time. Laws never can keep pace, so there's a huge amount of self-regulation that's required. Now, to answer your question, therefore, Gaurav, I think what should be done is, whenever any company is up against a situation where there is a potential of a downside risk because of some transgression, some kind of a situation where the company might hit a lot of turbulence, I think it is important for the managers, the CEO of the company, to first make an internal assessment of what is it that they're talking about, what is the right way to go about it, and they must definitely keep the board of governors, the board of directors, informed about their decision. They obviously might need to refine what they're doing a little later based on certain further information. But in my view, a good point is to start addressing the concern that is being flagged. And sometimes many of these things are very dynamic. You don't even know if you can answer that whole thing without uh, you know with all the information that you might have at the present moment. You may not be able to give out a suitable long-term solution. So you take a short first step, which is appropriate, ethical, which is from a governance perspective, it is right for all stakeholders. And maybe 6 months down the line, you revisit this and find out what might be the best way. But
Got
this kind of dynamic situation is bound to happen, because there never can be a proper one way to go about this. I mean, we have a terrible war happening in the Middle East right now, and there are many companies who might be affected by what's happening there. They will have to take a call based on what are the values that they have, and the values have to be underpinned on what is good for all people, what's good for planet Earth, what's good for all, for the environment, for society, for every stakeholder.
Right.
Okay,
So,
Gaurav?
right. Thank you so much, sir. So my second question is, when you showed the slide
No,
ESG, sorry,
yeah, yeah. No, I was thinking,
uh,
Gaurav, you keep that question parked for a bit. I'll come
yeah,
back to
sure.
you. There's a question from Ramani Gopalan, so take that
Got it. Got it,
question
sir.
first, okay? But then we'll take you again. Yeah, Ramani, go ahead. Very clearly, yes, go ahead. Okay, very good question, Ramani. Thank you for your comment and your question. uh, how is India doing compared to other countries? Okay, now when we talk about India, there are big companies, medium-sized companies, small companies, and I would like to focus on the large companies because they set the trend. They are the ones that are regulated by SEBI, by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, and everybody else. So I think let's focus on the bigger corporates, and they also have the resources and the wherewithal to do what is appropriate. And quite a lot of these smaller companies and the medium enterprises, they will follow what the bigger ones do. Now, my short answer, Ramani, about how is India doing, I think by and large, Indian companies are very, very keen to be compliant, to follow the rules. But I would not say that they're going too far out to be ethical, vis-a-vis, uh, you know, say what's happening in the country. They prefer to just be in step with what the requirements of the Companies Act are. They want to be in step with what the guidelines of say the Ministry of Corporate Affairs are, and so on. So they're by and large compliant with that. Or SEBI, if they're a listed company, SEBI makes certain provisions for listed companies. They're in compliance with that. Can they do better than this? Of course they can, because quite honestly, there are many aspects today where companies get caught up in areas which I think are unfortunate because no one is addressing them, and big companies should address them. So for instance, the funding that is needed for political parties and for elections and so on, many of the companies unfortunately get into all this, and that compromises their ability to be truly good corporate citizens, because then the stakeholders are not uniformly balanced, and therefore corporate governance might suffer. Now, how is it abroad, Ramani? Abroad, there are many large companies which are even worse than Indian companies. So frankly, there's a lot more that needs to be done. There are companies in South America that are, you know, blatantly denuding the forests in the Amazonian rainforests. There are many other companies who churn out effluents into the oceans. And so there's a huge amount of deficit when it comes to good governance in companies uniformly. But there are many others. Uh, I mentioned Tata's briefly. There are many other Indian companies who are trying to, uh, you know, push back against unethical rules and all that. But the numbers are still fewer than I would like. Okay, Ramani, does that answer your question? Okay. Okay. Gaurav says that my second question has also gotten answered thanks to Mr. Ramani. So good, as I say, where seems to be uh, alignment there. Okay, Mangesh has a point. He says that self-regulation seems to be ineffective, because of dispersed accountabilities between regulators, decision makers, external validators. So he wants to know what are my views on the uh, cultural learnings from our civilization history to come out of this lack of uniform cohesion from self-regulation. So here is the take, Mangesh. What you mentioned is truly a problem. The fact that accountabilities are dispersed, but accountabilities in the regulator, say there is SEBI. Now, one person in SEBI who makes or takes a stand and says, let us do it this way, is enough to transform the dynamics within SEBI, so that SEBI is able to monitor the performance of the listed companies much better. So while it is true that there may be only one person in SEBI who is trying to raise a flag, that one person, through his or her commitment to ethical governance and good corporate governance, can make a difference in the rules within SEBI itself. In the same way, in the companies concerned, one person saying that, look, by doing this, one manager, one leader saying that by doing this we might be adversely affecting the stakeholders who are dependent on the company for A, B, or C, can make a difference in the perception. So I'm not completely with you, Mangesh, when you say that self regulation is ineffective. It is not. In my view, self regulation is the heart of collective regulation. And even though we might feel that we are powerless because there are so many other players, we must still make our stand known, because it is always better to make your stand known than to be quiet. And in good organizations, even in board meetings, if there is a dissenting view about something, the dissenting view has to be recorded. That's part of the process. So I don't think you should ever worry about, the efficacy of you being only by yourself or it being a disjointed kind of a situation. No, please, my short answer to your question and comment, Mangesh, is please do not ever hesitate to take a stand on something, even if you seem to be the lone voice. You have no idea how powerful that can be sometimes in an organization or in a regulatory body. Okay. Okay, Shantanu, go ahead with your point.
Well, I think first of all, thank you very much for shedding some light on important aspect of ESG. Uh, I think in India, especially, if you look at the implementation of ESG, it is greatly dependent on the regulatory steps the government is going to take or taking for the implementations. So, can you shed some light from that perspective, how it is going to be impacting the companies, both from the perspective of shareholders versus the other stakeholders' interest getting resolved?
Okay, so Shantanu, here is the situation. Shareholders will certainly be treated a little bit, let's say, differently from other stakeholders because the shareholders have invested in the company. But having said that, in shareholders also you might have dominant shareholders and you might have minority shareholders. Again, there is a little differentiation there also. Minority shareholders sometimes feel that their interests are not safeguarded adequately. Dominant shareholders feel that they have a right because they're the dominant shareholders. They should be, it is their voice which must carry on. So, one thing, Shantu, that you have to appreciate, governance is not a set of rules that are fixed in time. Good corporate governance requires you as a leader or as a manager to understand that there is a certain dynamism or a dynamic that's at play all the time. And as I said in response to an earlier question, sometimes you might need to address